As a gardener, I am a great failure. Besides the fact that these are already popcorn seeds, not likely to grow anything, at one point in my life thought I might grow something, and I did some research. I actually built a little planting box in my backyard, and this was in Virginia when I was just out of college, and I planted watermelon seeds. And I was all excited. I had in my mind this incredible dream of giant watermelons and eating them with the family and having a great time with these watermelons. And I planted the seeds. I made sure that I spaced them out exactly. It was supposed to be 12 inches apart or something like this. I made sure that they were spaced out the right way. I had the right fertilizer in there, and I planted them. And what do you know? Nothing happened. At one point, I'm sure that I saw little sprouts pop up out of the ground. I'm sure that happened. I wasn't just dreaming. I'm sure I saw little sprouts come out of the ground. But I think as soon as they saw me, they ran away back into the ground. What did seem to grow well were some sort of weeds and thistles. And so, several months later, instead of having a watermelon feast, we had a thistle feast. It was not nearly what we were expecting. Paul, as he writes this letter of Corinthians, feels a little bit like I did as a gardener. Last week we were talking about how he had come and shared the simple message of Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And it was said in Acts 18 of his experience in Corinth that many people came to believe in Jesus Christ and were baptized. Oh, that's amazing. Many were believers and were baptized, and it was just an incredible witness of what Paul did when he was in Corinth. But as he is continued on his journey after spending a year and a half in Corinth, he hears these reports about what's happening in the Corinthian church. And he's starting to hear about some of the things that they're involved in. And we'll talk more about more of those issues, but he does hear that there's disunity and that people are quarreling amongst another. They're saying, no, we were people who believed in Paul. And then after Paul had left, he had entrusted the ministry to a young man by the name of Apollos. And others in the church were saying, well, we don't follow Paul anymore. He's the old stuff. He's old school. We're following Apollos. He's the great one. He's the new one. He's the apostle who's God give us. And others said, well, we're even better than the both of you. We're still following after Peter. He's the guy who Jesus said, I'm going to plant my church and the gates of hell will not come against it. We're following Peter. And these groups started to quarrel amongst each other. And Paul's hearing about this dissension, this disunity in the church. And he's thinking, what happened to the seeds that I planted? I had planted good seed and there's good soil, but somehow we're getting these weeds of disunity coming about in the church. And so he scratches his head saying, what happened? I had planted this good seed and I started to see those sprouts come out of the ground. I was excited to see that. But something has retreated. Something has gone back where it's not supposed to be. And so he starts to tell us a little bit about the spiritual climate of the church in Corinth. And the first thing he says that you cannot receive spiritual insight because you are carnal. You're focusing on fleshly things. It says you are a people of the flesh. You're focusing on externals. Part of this was somewhat obvious in that Apollos was sort of that dynamic, charismatic pastor that everybody wants to listen to. People would crowd from miles around to hear Apollos. He was so passionate in his exhortations that people would take that word and they'd put it into their life, and that was exciting stuff. And Apollos was just one of these people that would follow after Paul, and people said, yes, we're going to follow Apollos. He's got the word of Christ. We're going to listen to him. Now, Paul was sort of the opposite. He was known as being somewhat unattractive. He was a much stronger person in presence on paper than he was in person. And people said, well, I read his books and I was so excited about what he had to say, but when he showed up in person, better read the book. One of those kind of pastors. It's like, yeah, he had some good things to say, but, I'd really rather hear somebody who's more dynamic. And so there started to be this sort of quarreling amongst them, and what we hear is that people were just excited about what was on the outside, the appearances and the presentations of the gospel. And somehow that surface presentation started to distract them from the core piece of what was the spiritual work that God was using them to accomplish. He also says they were like infants. And by infants, he means that it's not possible for them to yet receive the solid food that he wants to give to them. As we were talking about last week, when Paul came, he decided that he would preach only the simple message that it was Jesus Christ and Him crucified. recognizing that it is through Christ that we have been saved, and only through Christ, and that everything else centers on that one point. And if we don't understand Jesus Christ, everything else is amiss. And in many ways, we could describe that simple message as the milk of the gospel. That piece that when we first come into the world, we need to have milk, right? Anyone who's had children or seen a young child knows that the thing that they eat first is milk. And they need to have milk for a period of time so they can grow and develop some maturity before they can get into solid food of some sort. I found a video that kind of describes that process, and it's really hard to share with you in words how cool it is to watch small children learn how to eat solid food. So I thought we'd show this to watch what that's like. So it's just kind of funny. It's really hard to describe those facial expressions. I know it's sometimes hard to see, but a good part of that period of time, he's trying to avoid getting that spoon in his mouth. For us, as we believe, as we come into faith, some of us really enjoy that spiritual milk. We enjoy knowing that Christ has saved us and that we are saved by grace alone and of His great love for us. But the hope is that we will start to develop some spiritual teeth. We'll start to develop some spiritual entity or a desire to grow spiritually, to go deeper into our walk with God, and not simply stay on the basic message of salvation, which is wonderful. And I know that I've actually attended some churches. When I was in college, I went to a pastor and I said, Pastor, it seems like the spiritual walk seems to be empty for me. I've learned the basic message, but I feel like there's something I'm missing. And he said, well, you got to go back to Jesus, go back to the cross, go back to salvation. I was like, but I'm looking for something else. I'm starting to look for where can I chew my teeth onto something, and going back to the salvation message seemed to be regression. And really the hope is for children that they do grow up, right? Can you imagine if they drink milk their whole life? That would not be a good solid diet. It needs to have food that we attach to them. And same thing with our spiritual walk, that God doesn't desire for us to just stay as infants. Certainly we are born in Christ, we receive His love, but we're actually supposed to grow and actually have the desire to be able to accomplish and understand more of the spiritual depths of what God would have for our lives. As Christians, too often we're fed with the easy stuff and we're told that's all you need. But the thing is, the depth of the power of who God is and the depth of what God can accomplish through His people is infinite and immense. The world has not yet seen the power of those who believe if they're 100% sold out to God. And that's God's desire for us, is to not just stay in the simple part. I mean, at the end of several years, if you've planted this sort of seed and you come back years later or a season later and you still got that seed, you're disappointed, right? You want to see something happen. Well, the same is true with the gospel. God came in the person of Jesus Christ into the world, not just so that we can understand that we've been saved in His love, but that once we understand that, now we can grow in our faith and we can begin to live out that life of who Jesus Christ calls us to be. And that requires us to grow some spiritual teeth. But he was noting that the Corinthian church had still stayed in an infant stage and they were not ready for the spiritual food. And he describes milk as the beginning part of the gospel, and the meat of being the depth of God's love, the depth of ministry that we are to participate in with God, called according to God's purpose, what He has desired for us. And he says, lastly, that they were not spiritually minded, and this is evident because of their quarreling and their jealousy. And he says they seem to be overcome by simply the presentations. They are not spiritually minded, they are fleshly minded. So when they came to church, they came because they were interested to know, is there good coffee? They came because they wanted to know, are there donuts in the foyer? They wanted to know, are the people around me good looking? And if there's somebody who I can sit with, who I like, the fleshly sorts of things. And he says it's evident that you are not spiritually minded, because if you were spiritually minded, you wouldn't be jealous of one another. You wouldn't have the quarrels that you have. You wouldn't be saying, I'm of one group, or I belong to that group, or whatever that is. I mean, in some ways, this could be said of our Christianity as a whole. I mean, how many of us feel so much superior because we're United Methodists instead of Baptist, or Nazarene, or Presbyterian, or whatever that denomination is? I mean, essentially, all of these denominations, all of these distinctions are fleshly minded. I mean, yeah, we do intinction, Another church says, no, well, we sprinkle, well, we do full dunk. We're the full baptism, we do this sort of thing. Well, really, are any of these things deep, or all these simply surface issues? I mean, the truth of the gospel is that what God has done for us is much deeper than any of these fleshly considerations. And so he noted of the climate of the Corinthian church, he said they were carnal, they infancy, and they were not spiritually minded. So what is the evidence that he gives for us of spiritual maturity? Spiritual maturity and vitality shows us first that Christ has got to be central to our identity and our calling. Who are you? The central piece of who you are. When he asked the Corinthians this way, they said, well, I am of Paul, or I am of Peter. Their central identity would not yet recognize that their central piece had to be of Jesus and of Christ, instead of all these other things. I mean, so often when I go to big conferences about the United Methodist Church, it does seem that too often the main point is whether or not we are going to grow the United Methodist Church. But that's absolutely secondary to the main point of how is the gospel being spread in our community? How is it that people are coming to know the loving, forgiving grace of God? And later on, if they decide that the Methodist Church is the way they want to live that out, wonderful. But the primary piece of this isn't our denomination or how we identify ourselves. The primary piece is God's message of love and grace. I mean, we can celebrate that, right? And as a whole church and as a whole community of faith, we can celebrate that we have Christ as a central piece of who we are and a central piece of what we are about. We are not about the ministry of the United Methodist Church. We are about the ministry of God as we see that here at the United Methodist Church. The central piece of that is Christ, not the way we would distinguish that. I know that also as a church we look at our past history and say, well, the only piece that made any sense to me in the church was when I had so-and-so as my pastor. And some pastors, and actually I'm not excluded to this, feel good about that. Oh, I'm glad that you enjoy me as your senior pastor. It's a good thing. And we develop this sort of codependent love relationship. I love you, oh, you love me. This is a good back and forth, right? But the thing is, what we hear in the gospel is that's not what it's about. We need to be able to grow out of this fleshly sort of seeing each other as part of it and recognize that throughout the whole history of our faith, God is providing persons who give us insight to how we can grow in our spiritual life. Not everyone provides the same insight. Not every pastor has the same gifts, talents, and abilities. But all of them are persons that God has given to us so we might grow in our faith. If we were to read on in the next chapter in this 1 Corinthians, he would describe how everything that God has brought about in our life has been so that we might grow into maturity of our faith. The growth in our calling to understand Him. The second identification of the evidence for spiritual maturity is that love is alive in the community. He's talking about this distinction between being fleshly minded or being spiritually minded, and further on in Galatians, he gives this interesting insight. And I want to share with you more on that. This is Galatians 5, following into verse 13. It says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out that you will yourselves be destroyed. So I say, walk by the Spirit as you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with one another, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." The central piece of what he's describing there is love. The whole series of what we're describing here is the transformation that is available to the church by the power of His love. As we experience the love of God transforming our lives, and we recognize the depth of our forgiveness that affects the way we relate to one another in the church. So often we have churches that split over simple things. I've heard about churches that split because of a change in the carpet, or because a Bible study group had to move from one classroom to another classroom, or because there was a schedule conflict for the Christmas Eve service. The churches split because of some of these mediocre things that are merely surface issues. I mean, the core of this piece that was supposed to be transforming the church is God's love and His grace. And I think one of the things we see exampled, if the church is truly understanding and living out that love, is an attitude of repentance and forgiveness. When we somehow step on each other's toes, we're more than accommodating to step over and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and the other person says, "No, no, no, my foot was in the wrong place." You know, we're working back and forth to try to find a way to share and give to one another, to love each other. I was recently told a story about two neighbors, and the strip of grass in between the two neighbors was greener than either one of their lawns. And when they were asked about it, they said, "Well, simply this, we want to extend the watering and the fertilizer because we're afraid of cheating the other person. And so we extend the fertilizer and the water just beyond the borders of our lawn." And the other person did the same thing. And so that central piece of grass between the two houses was greener because both of them were nurturing that relationship. And because of that compelling nurturing that they were doing together, the grass was able to grow and be nourished, even more than itself. You know, as a church, as we care for one another, we're supposed to become friends with each other and extend the grace of God to one another in such a way that between us there is an apartment of grace and grass, you know, that's growing, that just shows that there's love that is coming between us. You know, and too often we get sidetracked by fleshly issues. But where love prevails, disunity falls apart. Because we recognize and we see each other not as individuals, but we see each other as Christ. And we want to give to one another as Christ has given to us. The last thing he describes here is this concept of unity. Unity as a core essential and a marker of whether or not the church is growing in its maturity. If a church is stuck in disunity, it is obviously that they have not experienced the depth of the spiritual life, and that they are focusing on fleshly things that are not important. John Wesley talks about we should have unity in all things that are non-essential. Sorry, we have unity in all things that are essential, and of those things that are not essential, we should have grace. So of those things that are essential, unity. Belief in who Christ is. Belief in God. Non-essentials. What we're going to eat at coffee hour. Non-essentials. Who gets the 9 o'clock hour for our Bible study time? You know, which room do we get? Those are non-essentials to faith. They might have something to do with the way we live that out, but they're not essential to our faith. In the unity of the church, we need to be unified around the essentials of who we are in faith. All of this is about growing in faith. Paul, as he came back and heard the reports of the Corinthians, he was disheartened to hear that they had not grown in their faith. And at this church, we have been working with ways that we grow in our faith, and I want to spend a little bit of time pulling that out for us as a whole church to just look at a process in which we can grow in our faith. And I'm just going to use the same analogy that he's been using in talking about planting a seed. That first step in that wheel is, you know, a seed is planted in the ground. And that has to do with recognizing that when the sower, this is the parable that Jesus tells, the sower goes out into the field and he casts the seed. And some of the seed goes on hard ground, some of the seed is on soft soil, some is between rocky soil, and some is in thorny soil. But the sower is casting the seed. You know, in the same way, God's love extends to all the world, regardless of whether or not we are receptive to it. God's love is out there and available. God continues to pour out His grace to everyone, the good and the wicked, the same. God extends His love to everyone. And He plants the seed, and this just helps us recognize that God is a loving God. And this has to do with His radical hospitality of God, that He wants to bring in all persons, that they might know of His love and His grace. You know, this is that time in which we might ourselves recognize the hospitality of God and recognize God's invitation and His activity. You know, that part of the church where we have persons who come to visit us and they're hearing something of God's love and said, you know, that's an interesting idea. I didn't realize that I was lovable. I didn't realize that even though my life was a complete mess, that God still knows my pain and my suffering. I didn't realize that there were a bunch of other people who were a mess as well, who had found grace here and that God loves them. That's good news. That's really good news. I want to hear more. And that's where the seed of God is planted in our lives. The second part of this is that we water the seed. There needs to be some activity that helps the seed to grow. And we'll talk about that as passionate worship. Times when we gather together as a whole community and celebrate what we know as faith, what we hear in the Word, what happens with our songs and with our expressions of love back to God. As God touches our lives and invites us into a relationship with Him, the natural response is some sort of expression. You know, I know that this happens in relationships. You know, you go to somebody and say, "I love you," and if that person says, "I love you too," there's a good thing happening, right? But if you said, "I love you," and the other person says, "That's interesting," just kind of walk away, that wouldn't be much of a relationship, would it? It was kind of dead end at that point. The idea is that as the church, we hear God's invitation of love, and worship is our way of saying, "I love you too." This is the way I know to say to God, "I love you." And we do that through worship, and that somehow in the worship experience it cultivates within our heart a desire for an understanding of the greatness of God. The depth of the mystery of God's love for us transforms us from our earthly experience, our fleshly understanding of what it means to live, and gives us the understanding that there's more to life. And that begins the process of opening the seed to know that there's more that God would have for our lives. And so we respond with that expression of love back to God. That third phase we're calling planting, the plant begins to sprout and is nurtured. This is that intentional faith development. Once we have understood something of God's grace, we've understood something of His love, and that there is more out there than the day-to-day routine of life, and that God calls us to greater understanding, we have the choice. We each have the chance to respond, to say, "Yes, I am going to grow," or to say, "No, I'm going to retain my soul, my place as just enjoying that experience." And for many Christians, that is where things end. They've experienced God's love, they come to worship, and that's where things stop. But God would want us to move on, to grow in maturity and to grow in our faith. And this requires intentional faith development. It's an intentional piece that we decide to grow. We grow by connecting with other believers. And this can happen in our small groups that happen throughout the week. It can happen in Sunday school classes. It can happen through our Alpha program, which is happening on Sunday nights. But the way we grow in faith is we connect with other believers and we look into the Word to grow in Bible study and other sorts of groups that will challenge us in our thinking and the way we live out our lives. And also encourages us to start to explore some spiritual disciplines of prayer and of meditation, of reading the Scriptures for ourselves, of corporate prayer together. Intentionally growing in our faith, taking that next step and say, "Okay, I want to grow as a Christian. I don't want to just stay on the surface." Fourth part of this is as that plant grows, it begins to mature. This is beginning to understand, now that I'm growing in my faith, there's ways that I can give back. I understand myself as a steward, that is, somebody who is using what God has given to me. I begin to understand myself in relationship to God. And so I express that as extravagant generosity. Now that I know God's generosity for me, I'm going to express that back to God in generosity. We begin to recognize God's primacy in one of our activities. As we think about our resources, we think about our life, we start saying, well, where does God fit into the bigger picture of my life? And recognize that God is the central piece to everything that I do in my life. And as we put God in the center of our life as the number one priority, it shifts the other priorities in our life and it changes the way we live that out. Sometimes I think of this in terms of when a seed is growing out of the ground, it needs to have some sense of direction. I have tried to plant tomatoes, but as they crawl across the dirt, they don't grow very well, and the ants and the insects seem to enjoy what I'm doing there. Tomatoes, as well as our spiritual lives, require something to help give direction. In the Christian life, we need to have brothers and sisters and others who help come alongside of us to give us some sense of balance, to partner with us in our faith. It's a natural part for our Christian life to have a brother or sister who is a little further ahead of us in our faith walk to talk with, to ask questions about. You know, how did you deal with temptation in this part of your life? Or how did you deal with loneliness or depression? How did you deal with these sorts of issues? And as we're exploring how do we work through addiction issues as a church, that's certainly the piece of it, is persons who have gone before and said, I've found some success, I've found some victory in knowing that God loves me, and just asking those questions. How did you find that? Partnering together. We also begin to explore spiritual habits. How do we live out a pattern of faith that continues to demonstrate my faithfulness to God, that helps me to grow daily in my understanding? Fasting and prayer. Things that require some time and effort, but we commit those times to God that we would grow and know Him more. And finally, the whole point is not just for the seed to grow into a nice seedling or for it to have a good sprout, but that the ultimate point is for everything that is planted, that it would bear fruit. That itself would reproduce. Part of this is recognize that we as a church are called to risk-taking mission. We're called not just to care for ourselves and have a great worship experience, but also to care for our community, to care for the world, to understand who is it that God has called us to be, what are the gifts, talents, and abilities that God has given to us, and how is it that He is calling us to reach out. Now, the reason I wrote this on the slide, it says, responding to God's invitation to reach, and I put in parentheses. Now, that wasn't a mistake. It does sort of look like a typo. But the reasons I simply put the parentheses is I wanted you to try to fill in the blank. Who is it that God is asking you to speak with? Who is it? Who are those persons that God is asking you to be in a relationship with? Is asking you to extend yourself in ministry with, to say, God has touched my life, can I share that good news with you? Or maybe just sitting with someone who is needing to have you listen to the pain that they're going through. Who are those persons? And I know I was talking with a candidate for ministry lately, and he was talking about, for him, that had to do with those who are not receiving justice, who continue to be oppressed. I said, amen. Now let's work on the details of who are those persons. And I think for all of us, we have to understand what are those persons, who are those passions that God has put into our life, those people that we can connect with. Understanding the gifts that we have, the people who God is asking us to reach, takes us as a church into mission. Takes us outside of the doors of the church to extend His love to all who are in need. And certainly that might be for a season of time. For 4 or 5 years, we care for those who have been affected by the hurricane that came through Alabama and Mississippi with Katrina. After a period of time, we say, well, what else is happening in the world? Where else is God moving us? We recognize, okay, there are people in Thailand and Bangkok who are suffering from slavery to alcohol and pornography and to sex trade. Well, that might be something that God puts in our heart. But the parentheses is open for us as a church to discern what is it that God is calling us to reach. I know as we did a walk around in this community last January, we recognized that there was a big need in our community. Besides the sort of obvious, everyone in our community is struggling with finances. The second one, which was a very close second, was that in our community we have a high number of people who are either themselves suffering with addiction or have family members who are wrestling with substance abuse. I mean, for every one person who is stuck in addiction, you have a whole family system that surrounds them. We recognize that this community, that is a major need. And that's why we as a church are starting to explore how do we do ministry with those persons who are affected and families that are affected by substance abuse. That's the way that the church steps out in ministry, is we recognize that if we are a church that excels in loving relationships, what would that look like if we loved other persons? Shared with them the love of God. That's a dynamic ministry that I think that we can be called to be a part of this next year. All of these, and I put this as a, sort of a circle, and that any part of this is when people can actually enter into the circle of the church. Some people don't find Christ in a worship service, but they do find Christ on the mission field. Some people come to Christ when they recognize at the end of their means that God is calling them to give. Extravagant generosity. Sometimes people come to find Christ through Bible study, through individual part of looking through the Word and study, and God speaks to their heart. I met with a Jewish man about a month ago, and he was so excited. He said, "Did you realize that Jesus is the Messiah?" I said, "Yeah, I kind of did." He's like, "Well, it's amazing." He started pulling out these scriptures in Isaiah. He's like, "Did you realize that Jesus fulfilled that?" I was like, "Yeah, I kind of did." He's like, "Why aren't you telling people?" I'm so excited about this. But he came to Christ on his own as he was reading through the scriptures, and he found that Jesus was the Messiah and God just spoke to his heart. I put this as a circle because the central piece of who we are is Christ. And that regardless of which point we come into the church, we are moving to a greater awareness of who Christ is in our life, as he is the central piece of who we are. Now this is very different than a church that says you become a part of this church when you fit this description in this box of what it means to be a good and cleaned up Christian type of person. And once you have fixed our parameters, our definition of a Christian, then you are in. And if you're not in, then you are out. And if you fit this description, then we can agree that you're somebody that we're willing to be in a relationship with. You're in. But everyone else we're not sure about yet. Now the difference is that if we're looking at this as a central diagram, and Jesus is the center, who is it that Christ is not calling? Well, Christ is calling everyone, isn't he? And all of us, if Christ is calling us inward to understand him, then all of us are on the same journey. And our relationship then changes. Instead of saying we are the guardians of who's in and who's out, we recognize we are people who are walking alongside.